The rain came sideways that night. Not the soft kind that taps on windows and makes you think of sleep. This was the kind that meant business. The kind that turns dirt roads to mud and drops the temperature 10 degrees in an hour and makes the whole world feel like it's closing in around you, pressing in from every direction until there's nowhere left to go. Out on County Road 940 miles east of Tulsa, the fields had gone black on both sides, and the asphalt was running with water the color of iron, sheeting across the road in long, flat rivers that caught the headlights and threw them back broken. Everett Gaines had been driving in rain like this for 50 years. He knew how to read it. He knew when to pull over and when to push through when the sky was done and when it was just getting started. Tonight he'd made the wrong call, and he knew that too because the old sedan had started coughing somewhere around the 9-mile marker, that particular stuttering cough that means something fundamental has given up. And by the time he nursed it to the shoulder, the engine had quit entirely. One long shudder like a sigh, then nothing. He turned the key 3 times. Nothing. He sat there a moment with both hands still on the wheel, listening to the rain hammer, the roof listening to the sound of a car that had decided it was finished for the night. Then he looked over at his wife. Loretta had her coat pulled up to her chin and her hands tucked under her arms, and she was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the wall of rain and the dark beyond it. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They'd been married 49 years, and he could read her the way he could read weather, the way he could read a room full of strangers. She was cold. She was tired. And she was working very hard not to show him either one, because that was Loretta. That had always been Loretta, making herself small in the difficult moments, so the difficulty wouldn't feel any larger than it had to. She was 73 years old. Her heart had been giving them trouble for 2 years now. The cardiologist up in Tulsa, a careful man who chose his words the way a lawyer chooses precedents, had told them both in the same flat, measured voice that stress and cold were the 2 things she needed to avoid. He had not said it as a suggestion. He had said it the way you say something when you want the person across the desk to understand there is no negotiation here, no interpretation, no middle ground. Stress and cold. Those were the 2 things. Right now she had both. "We can't stay here," Everett said. "I know," Loretta said. She didn't argue. That was the thing about Loretta, the thing he had understood about her before he fully understood anything else. 49 years, and she had never once wasted a word on an argument that was already over. If the situation was what it was, she accepted the situation. She saved her energy for the things that could actually be changed. He got out into the rain and walked around to her side and helped her out, and she held his arm the way she'd held it since 1959, with her hand through the crook of his elbow, and her fingers light but certain, the grip of a woman who had decided a long time ago that this was where her hand went and had never reconsidered. They stood together on the shoulder of County Road 9 in the dark and the rain, and Everett looked back down the road the way they'd come. One light, maybe a quarter-mile back. A low building set off the highway with a gravel lot out front and a neon sign in the window throwing red across the wet ground. He'd passed it without looking, the way you pass things when you're focused on where you're going and not on what's beside the road. Most people passed it without looking. That was probably deliberate. He knew what kind of place it was. The layout had told him that much: the low profile, the gravel, the position just far enough off the highway to be its own world. But there were no trucks in that lot. There were motorcycles. Dozens of them lined up in rows under the overhang chrome, catching the neon red engines cold and still ranked up like some kind of iron congregation, waiting for a service that hadn't started yet. He stood there in the rain and did the math that a man does when his choices have run out. When there's only one door left and you know what's behind it and you go anyway because the alternative is standing in the rain with your wife's lips turning blue. "Come on," he said. They walked. It took them 10 minutes on wet asphalt, with the rain coming at them sideways and the dark pressing in from the fields on both sides. Loretta didn't complain once. She kept her head down against the rain and her hand in the crook of his elbow, and she walked one foot and then the other, the way she had always moved through hard things, without drama, without commentary, just forward. That was 73 years old with a bad heart, and she walked through a storm on a county road because there was nothing else to do, and she understood that as well as he did. Maybe better. By the time they reached the door, her lips had gone a shade of blue that scared him in a way he didn't let himself look at directly. He could hear it from outside. Not music, not laughter, not the sounds a place makes when people are inside enjoying themselves. The sound coming through that door was furniture breaking and men shouting in the specific register of men who have stopped caring about the consequences of what they're saying, and something heavy hitting the floor hard enough to send a vibration through the gravel under his feet. Everett stood there with his hand on the door and took in all of that and knew exactly what kind of room was on the other side of it. He pushed the door open anyway. What he walked into was the middle of a war. 20 men, maybe more, packed into a long, low room with a bar running down one side and a pool table overturned in the center and glass on the floor in every direction. Two of them were still going at it near the far wall, one with blood running freely from a cut above his eyebrow, the other with his shirt half torn away, and his face the particular dark red of a man who has been hit hard and is running on rage and momentum. Three more were being physically restrained by their own brothers, not successfully. A chair had been broken against something and the pieces were still sliding across the floor, still moving, still settling. And in the middle of all of it, like a post that a storm breaks around, stood the biggest man Everett Gaines had ever seen in his life. He was 6'3", maybe more. Broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with a gym and everything to do with 6 decades of being built the way he was built. Gray beard, thick neck hands the size of small shovels, a leather vest covered in patches that marked him as clearly as any uniform marks the man who outranks everybody else in the room. He had just grabbed two men by their collars and thrown them in opposite directions, the way another man might move a pair of chairs, and he was standing in the space between them, breathing hard through his nose and looking at the room around him with the flat, calculating look of a man assessing what still needs to happen. Then the cold air hit the back of his neck and he turned, and the whole room turned with him. 20-something men in that condition, men with split knuckles and violence still running hot in their blood. All of them stopped at the same moment, because what they saw when they turned made no sense at all. Not in that room, not on a night like that. Two old people in the doorway, soaking wet. The man in a gray jacket with the collar turned up against the rain, the woman in a flowered coat with water running off the brim of her hat. Standing there, the way people stand when they've knocked on a door and aren't entirely certain it was the right one. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Then a voice from near the bar, young and sharp. "Who the hell are you?" The one who said it was lean and wiry with a shaved head and a chain on his belt, and the kind of face that had spent years looking for trouble and finding it without much difficulty. He had pushed himself off the bar and was standing with his weight forward and his eyes hard. Later, Everett would learn they called him Razor, and that the name fit him the way names fit people when they've grown into them completely, because everything about him was designed to cut, to find the edge of a thing and press against it until it gave. "This ain't a church," Social Razor said. "You're in the wrong place." Everett didn't look at him. He'd spent 30 years selling insurance across 3 counties in eastern Oklahoma, and in 30 years of walking cold into rooms full of strangers, he had learned the single most important thing you can learn about a room. Find the man who matters and talk to him. Not the loudest one. Not the one nearest the door. Not the one who speaks first. The one the other men's eyes go to when the situation becomes genuinely complicated. That man. That's the conversation that counts. Every eye in that room, even the ones that belonged to men still being held back against the wall, had gone to the big gray-bearded man in the center when that door opened. Everett looked straight at him and said, "Our car died up the road. My wife has a heart condition. She can't be out in this cold. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for anything except a dry chair and maybe the use of a phone. Can we rest here?" The room held its breath. The big man looked at Everett for a long moment with those flat, assessing eyes. Then he looked at Loretta. She was holding on to her husband's arm, and her lips were still blue at the edges, and she was doing the thing she always did in difficult situations, had always done the thing that had caught Everett's heart the very first time he saw her do it 49 years ago. She was standing up straight and making herself small at the same time. taking up as little space as possible in a room that hadn't invited her, trying not to be a burden, trying to be so unobtrusive that the difficulty of the situation might somehow not apply to her. That got him. The quiet dignity of it in the middle of all that wreckage. "Razor," he said. His voice was flat and low, and it did not rise even slightly. "Get the lady a chair by the heater." Razor's jaw came forward. "You serious? We don't know these people. We're in the middle of something here, and you want me to go get a chair for some old... Get the lady a chair." Same voice, same absolute flatness. The room had learned over many years what that particular tone meant when it came from this particular man, and Razor had learned it too, whatever he personally thought about it. He got the chair. Loretta sat down beside the heater, and slowly over the next several minutes, the blue faded from the edges of her lips, and the shivering that she'd been suppressing eased, and the color came back into her face by degrees like a lamp being turned up. Everett stood beside her with one hand on her shoulder. He kept his voice low when he spoke to her, and he kept his eyes moving around the room. Not nervous exactly, just careful. The way a man keeps his eyes moving when he's in unfamiliar territory and wants to understand the landscape. The big man came over with a mug of coffee. His hand wrapped around it completely, swallowed the whole mug, and he held it out toward Loretta with a deliberateness that suggested he was being careful about something. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it's hot." Loretta took it with both hands and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. Just that. Plain and direct, and without any performance in it, the way Loretta always said things that she meant. And something about that plainness seemed to knock something loose in the big man, seemed to land somewhere he hadn't been prepared for it to land. He didn't know what to do with it. He just nodded once a single dip of that enormous head and stepped back. His name was Boone Rourke. He had been called Iron for 20 years, though he'd never asked for the name and would not have chosen it if he had been asked. He had been president of the Iron Saints for 15 of those years, which meant that everything that happened inside these walls was ultimately his responsibility, his to answer for his to manage. The club had been on this stretch of County Road 9 for 30 years, through hard times and harder ones, through members who came and members who left and members who didn't come back at all. It had survived things that should have ended it. What it had not survived yet was itself. That was what tonight had been about. The vote that went wrong and the fists that followed, as they always follow among men who feel strongly about things and have spent years learning to settle disagreements with their bodies. Half the club wanted to sell the building and the land under it and take the money and scatter to wherever the wind took them. The other half would burn it down before they'd let that happen. Boone had seen it coming for months, the way you see weather coming when you live close enough to open country to read the air. He had held the Iron Saints together through every other kind of trouble that 30 years can produce. He had not been able to hold them together through this. Now the room was doing what rooms do when violence has burned itself down to ash. Men drifted to corners and walls. Someone gathered the pieces of the broken chair and took them out the back. Someone else moved glass toward the wall with their boot. The fight was paused, not finished, and everyone in the room understood the difference. But for now, the heat had gone out of it, and two strangers had arrived. And the strangers were an old man who looked like he might have sold you a policy once, and an old woman in a flowered coat sitting by the heater with both hands around a mug of coffee. It is genuinely difficult to go back to breaking furniture with somebody's grandmother watching. Everett stood beside his wife and looked around the room the way he always looked at rooms, carefully, with the habit of a man who has spent his professional life reading what people put on their walls and understanding what it tells him about them, what they protect, what they're proud of, what they cannot bring themselves to take down even after it no longer makes practical sense to leave it up. This room had a wall covered in photographs, decades of them. Men on motorcycles on open highways with the sky enormous above them. Men standing together with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning into the sun with the uncomplicated happiness of people who know exactly where they belong. Men at what looked like funerals, standing straight and serious in their leathers, with their hands at their sides and their faces doing the work that faces have to do at funerals. Men who were gone now. You could tell by the quality of the old photographs, by the fading, by the clothes and the bikes, and the youth in the faces, a youth that time had either deepened into something else or simply ended. And over the bar, centered on that wall, the way a cross is centered in a church, hung a flag with the club's name stitched across it in thread that had faded from whatever it once was to a color between gold and brown. Everett's eyes moved across those photographs, the way his eyes always moved across the things people put on their walls, reading them without deciding to the habit so deep it happened on its own. He looked at faces. He took in expressions and postures and the specific quality of joy in the old pictures versus the more complicated expressions in the newer ones. He did this without thinking about it. The automatic practice of a man who has spent decades understanding that people tell you everything if you know how to look. And then his eyes stopped. They stopped on a photograph near the top of the wall, a little to the right of center, in a plain black frame that was slightly newer than the ones around it. A young man on a motorcycle caught in mid-laugh. His head turned slightly toward the camera, as though the photographer had called his name right at the moment of the shutter. Dark hair longer than it probably should have been falling across his forehead. A grin that took up his entire face. The kind of grin that makes the person wearing it look like they know something good that they're about to tell you. A leather vest with an Iron Saints patch on the chest, the same patch that was on every vest in the room. The photograph was perhaps 20 years old. You could tell by the grain of the image, by the quality of the light, by a dozen small details that add up to a decade without your being able to name any single one of them. But the face in it was as clear as anything Everett Gaines had seen in his life. He knew that face. He had known it since the moment it came into the world. His hand tightened on Loretta's shoulder, and she felt the change in his grip and looked up at him. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Her voice was low, meant only for him. He couldn't answer yet. The answer was too large and too sudden to come out as words, not yet. He walked away from her chair slowly across the room past the pool table that someone had gotten upright again during the quiet past two men who watched him go with their arms folded. He walked until he was standing directly beneath that photograph, close enough to read the small brass plate pinned to the wood paneling below the frame. A name, two dates, 12 years between them. He stood there without moving for a moment. The room had gone quiet around him again, the way a room goes quiet when it notices that something is happening that it doesn't yet understand. He could feel the eyes on his back. He didn't care about the eyes. That photograph, he said. His voice had changed in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with what was happening behind it. Something had shifted in the place beneath the chest where the things you don't say live. "Where did you get that photograph?" Behind him, Razor came off the bar. "Hey, I told you, nobody looks at that wall like that. That wall is family. Every man up there, we bled for him. You don't come in here off the street and stand in front of that wall like you have some kind of right to, 'That's my son.' 3 words." The room didn't go quiet. It stopped. There is a difference. Quiet is what happens when noise ends. What happened in that room was something that noise had nothing to do with, a cessation of something more fundamental than sound, the feeling of 20 people simultaneously holding a single breath. Razor stopped mid-sentence with his mouth still open and the next word still forming. Boone, who had been moving across the floor, went completely still, where he stood, 1 foot still raised. The 2 men with their arms folded let their arms fall. The man near the back, who had been pushing glass with his boot, stopped pushing. "What did you say?" Boone said. Everett turned around. There were tears in his eyes, the kind that come from a place so deep that even a man who has spent years learning to hold things together can't intercept them before they arrive. He wasn't trying to hold them back now. There was no point in it. "Connor Gaines," he said. "My son. He left home when he was 19 years old. We barely heard from him after that. We knew he rode with a club somewhere out east. We never knew which one. We wrote letters to addresses that stopped being good. We called numbers that got disconnected. He said he would come home. He said he was working up to it." He stopped, took a breath. "He died in 1996, Everett said. A motorcycle accident on a wet road not 40 miles from where I'm standing right now. The county called us. We drove out and we identified him, and we brought him home and we buried him. And we never knew the men he called his brothers. We never knew what he built out here. We never knew what he was to the people who knew him when we couldn't. His voice broke on those last words, the way old wood breaks, not a crash, just a clean, quiet crack through the middle of something solid. Until right now. Until I walk through that door by accident on the worst night I've had in years. And there he is, on your wall, in a frame, with his name on a plate. Nobody breathed. Across the room, Loretta had set down her coffee mug. She was trying to stand. Her legs were not steady, and she had to push herself up with both hands on the armrests. But she stood and she came across the room toward her husband, the way she moved through every hard thing in her life, without hurry, without stopping one step and then the next. The men in the room stepped back to make a path for her without being asked. She came and stood beside Everett and looked up at the photograph of the boy she had carried, and named and raised and lost. She looked at his face in that plain black frame, at the dark hair and the enormous grin and the happiness in him that was so complete and so unguarded that even a 20-year-old photograph couldn't contain it entirely. She put her hand over her mouth, and she made a sound that no roomful of hard men has ever prepared for. Not a wail, not a sob. Something smaller and more devastating than either of those things. The sound a person makes when they find something they had quietly over years stopped believing they would ever find. The sound of a door opening that had been sealed so long you'd forgotten it could open. Boone Rourke crossed the room. This man, this enormous gray-bearded man with hands like the flat of a spade and a president's patch on his chest and 30 years of hard living written into every line of his face, crossed the floor in 4 strides and stood in front of Everett and Loretta Gaines. And when he spoke, his voice had gone somewhere. He almost never allowed it to go somewhere rough and low and stripped of everything that usually protected it. Connor Gaines, Boone said. He said it the way you say the name of something you keep in a specific place, somewhere private, somewhere you don't open casually. We called him Preacher. He stopped, collected himself. Because he was the only man I have ever known in my life who genuinely, truly believed that people could be good. Not as something you say, not as a position you take, as a thing you live by every single day, even when the evidence runs against you. He believed it the way some men believe in weather or gravity, as a fact of the world that doesn't require defending. Boone looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, there was something in his face that men like him spend most of their adult lives making sure other people never see. He pulled me out of a wreck on the highway in the spring of 1989, Boone said. I'd gone over the guardrail on a night very much like this one. Wet road, no visibility, wrong moment. He was passing through first one on the scene. He stayed with me until the ambulance came, and he rode to the hospital behind it, and he gave blood because they needed my type. And he happened to match, and I didn't find that out until 2 days later when I came around enough to ask questions, and the nurse told me. He'd already gone by then, left his name with the desk, and rode out without waiting to be thanked. He swallowed. I would not be standing in this room tonight if it wasn't for your boy. He paused. I would not be standing anywhere. And I have spent 12 years wanting to find his family, wanting to tell you what he was to us, what he meant. I knew his name. I knew he was from somewhere in eastern Oklahoma. I didn't know more than that, and he never talked about home directly, and I always told myself there was a reason for that he was working up to something, that he had a plan for how he was going to go back and tell you where he'd ended up and who he'd become. Boone stopped again. I think he was almost ready, Boone said quietly. I think he was close. Loretta reached up. She was not a tall woman, and Boone Rourke was not a short man, and she had to reach considerably, but she put her hand against the side of his bearded face, the way a mother puts her hand against a face, with a completeness and a certainty that has nothing to do with the size of either party and everything to do with what the gesture means. She held it there. You just told us, she said. 4 words. That was the moment. That was the particular thing that cracked the room open, the way certain small things crack, enormous things. Not with force, but with precision. finding the exact place where the break was always going to happen. You can spend a lifetime building walls. You can learn to take the hits and hold your face still and stand in the center of a brawl without flinching and be the person the room looks to when things go wrong. You can do all of that successfully for decades, can make a practice and a discipline of it. And then one small woman, 73 years old, puts her hand against your face in the right moment and says the right four words, and everything you built goes soft in a way that has nothing to do with weakness. There were men in that room who had done prison time for things they didn't discuss, men with scars from events that didn't get talked about, men who had stood at graves without crying and sat through the kind of news that breaks most people without letting it break them. Men who had made a long study out of not feeling things in front of other people. Every one of them felt it. The room was completely still. Nobody was moving glass with their boot or nursing a split lip or thinking about the argument that had turned into a brawl an hour ago. They were just standing in a circle around two old people and a photograph and a story that had been waiting 12 years to reach the people it belonged to. Boone was still holding Loretta's hands in both of his, those enormous, careful hands, when Razor came across the room. Not the way he'd come off the bar earlier, not with his weight forward and his eyes hard. He came slowly with the particular deliberateness of a man who isn't sure of his welcome, but is coming anyway because something requires it of him. He stopped a few feet back from where Everett was standing, and he looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked up. Connor used to talk about a road trip, Razor said. His voice had lost all the edge it usually carried, leaving something raw underneath. About going back, seeing his folks. He talked about it like it was a real plan, like it was something already half arranged, something he was going to do as soon as the timing was right. He stopped. He said his mother made the best coffee in the state of Oklahoma. Said he'd been drinking bad coffee for years out of some misguided loyalty to the idea that something better was out there and nothing had come close. Loretta made a sound that lived somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. He was right, she said. It was very good coffee. Nobody laughed, but the room breathed again. You could feel it, the specific release of a breath held too long. All around them, the photographs watched from the wall. All those faces from all those years. Men who had come through that door and put their names on this place, and their time into it, and their loyalty, and in some cases, everything they had. Connor Gaines among them. Up on that wall for 12 years, watched over and remembered and rung for every year on the anniversary of his death. While his parents drove through their grief 40 miles away, not knowing that anyone out here remembered his name. Until tonight, until a cracked fuel line on County Road 9 in the rain, until an old man pushed open a door he had no particular reason to push open and found his son on the wall inside. Boone was still holding Loretta's hands when the light swept across the front windows. Not one pair of headlights, many. Coming in fast from the direction of the highway, swinging into the gravel lot, one after another, in a procession that spoke of organization, of intention, of people who had been somewhere else and had decided to be here. The sound of the engines followed a beat behind, not the settled idle of bikes cooling down, but the hard, aggressive rev of machines driven fast and pulled up short. Razor was at the window before anyone said a word. He moved with the instinct of a man who has learned over years that lights in a parking lot at night require immediate assessment. He looked out through the rain-streaked glass at the lot and at the shapes moving in it, and at the headlights still swinging as more of them pulled in. And he stood there for 3 full seconds, counting, calculating, understanding what he was looking at. When he turned back around, the color had left his face entirely. "It's the vultures," he said. "All of them. Harlan brought everybody he has." The room changed. Not loudly. You don't need noise for a room to change that completely. The warmth that had built up over the last 30 minutes, the particular fragile warmth of a hard thing, becoming something else, didn't disappear exactly. It just found itself surrounded by something colder and considerably more immediate. Boone Rourke let go of Loretta's hands. He straightened to his full height, that considerable height, and his face went back to what it had been when Everett first saw it, the still, flat, calculating look of a man who has been dealing with problems that have no clean solutions for long enough that his face has learned to prepare itself automatically. The men of the Iron Saints arranged themselves without instruction. It was old habit, old training, the deep muscle memory of men who have spent years together in situations where you want your feet under you and your brothers at your shoulder without having to think about either. Outside, the engines cut one by one. The silence after each one was a different kind of silence. Loretta sat back down in the chair by the heater and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the door with the composed, attentive expression of a woman who has decided that if something is coming, she intends to see it clearly. Everett stood beside her with his hand back on her shoulder, and he looked at the door too. The rain kept coming down. Boone moved first. He crossed the room in 4 strides and positioned himself between the front door and everything behind it. And without raising his voice, he said 2 words that got every man in the room moving immediately. Back wall, that was all. And 20 men who had been tearing each other in half an hour ago moved in the same direction without a word of argument. Because whatever had divided them tonight, they had all come up in the same school, and the school had one lesson that superseded every other. When something uninvited comes through the front door, you close ranks. Boone looked over at Everett. His voice stayed level, carefully level. "There's a room in the back," he said. "My office, door locks from inside. I need you both in there right now." Everett looked at him. He didn't move toward the back. He didn't reach for Loretta's arm. He stood where he was beside her chair with his hand on her shoulder, and he looked at Boone Rourke, the way he had looked at difficult men his entire professional life, with patience and without apology and without any intention of being moved. "My wife can't run," Everett said, "and I won't leave her, and I will not hide behind a locked door while men who love my son get shot in front of me." Boone started to answer. Everett kept going. His voice was calm, the calm of a man who has already thought this through and arrived at his position and is simply communicating it. "So whatever you're going to do tonight," he said, "you do it knowing we're standing right here. That's not stubbornness. That's just the truth of the situation." Boone looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not the irritation of a man being disobeyed, and not the calculation of a man reassessing a variable. Something closer to recognition. The look of someone seeing a quality in another person that they understand from the inside because they have lived by it themselves. He turned back to his men without another word on the subject. The front door opened before the room had fully settled into its new configuration. Harlan Slade did not knock. Men like Harlan Slade had stopped knocking on things a considerable time ago. He came through the door the way water comes through a crack, not with force, not with drama, just with the quiet inevitability of a substance finding the path of least resistance and following it. He was tall and lean with a gray ponytail pulled back tight against his skull, and pale eyes that moved around a room the way a camera moves systematically, taking in everything, assigning value, registering threat, and assessing it in the same unhurried motion. He wore his colors like a man who had earned the right to them through methods he did not regret. 6 men came in behind him and arranged themselves near the door without being directed to. The other 9 stayed outside. You could hear them on the gravel, moving, taking positions. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be subtle. Slade looked at Boone. He let the silence sit for a moment with the ease of a man who has learned that silence applied correctly is a kind of pressure. "Boone," he said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. The voice of a man continuing a discussion that had been interrupted rather than beginning a confrontation. "I gave you a month to think it over. The month is up." Boone said nothing. Slade's eyes moved around the room with that camera efficiency, touching on each face and each pair of hands and each position, filing everything. Then they reached the 2 old people. Everett standing beside the chair, Loretta in the chair by the heater with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her expression composed. Slade's face shifted, not softened, shifted. The calculating look sharpened into something with an additional edge, the look of a man who has spotted a piece on the board that he hadn't expected. "What's this?" he said. "Stranded travelers," Boone said. "Their car died up the road. It doesn't concern you." "Everything in this building concerns me tonight," Slade said. "That's the entire point of the evening." He looked at Everett with those flat, pale eyes for a moment, an assessing look, a look that measured and found nothing threatening and moved on. Then he smiled, and the smile was the kind that contains teeth and intention and nothing else. Running a retirement home now, Boone. He let that hang in the air. Expanding your operation. Nobody in the room laughed, not even his own men. Slade moved to the center of the room with the unhurried ease of a man who believes the outcome of the night has already been determined and that what's happening now is simply the formality of arriving at it. He stopped near the pool table, put one hand on the edge of it, and looked at Boone across the room with those camera eyes that were always measuring something. "Here's where we are," Slade said. "The Iron Vultures have been running this stretch of county for 2 years. You know that. Every man in this room knows it. Everybody between here and the county line knows it. What this building sits on is the last piece of this stretch that we don't control. I've offered you money twice. Fair money. You said no. I've explained the reality of the situation clearly. You said no again. So now we're at the part of the evening where I stop asking questions and start making statements." He paused to let that settle. "I want the deed to this property. Tonight. You sign it over and you walk away with the offer I made you last month, and nobody has a night they'll regret. That's the complete offer. It doesn't improve from here." The room held its configuration. 20 men against the back wall and 6 of Slade's men near the front door, and 9 more outside on the gravel, and 2 old people in the center of it all, and a dead boy's photograph watching from the wall above the bar. Boone Rourke looked at Harlan Slade across 15 feet of barroom floor and said nothing. And then something happened that nobody in that room had predicted. Razor moved, not toward the back wall, not toward the door. He came off the wall where he'd been standing, and he walked across the floor with deliberate steps, and he put himself beside Boone, shoulder to shoulder, and he crossed his arms, and he looked at Slade. Slade noticed. He noticed everything. His eyes went to Razor and stayed there. "Interesting," Slade said. "Last I heard you were the one who wanted to sell." Razor's jaw worked. He looked at the floor. He looked at the wall of photographs. He looked back at Slade. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, and had none of the edge it usually carried, as though the edge had been filed off by the last hour. "That was before tonight," Razor said. Slade waited. "The old man standing over there," Razor said. "That's Connor's father, Connor Gaines. He was Iron Saints before half the men in this room ever heard of us." He stopped. Something was moving in his throat. "In '92, my mother was 3 months behind on her prescriptions, and she didn't have the money, and she was too proud to let anyone know it, which was exactly the kind of thing she would do. Connor found out through someone. I don't know how he had a way of knowing things about people that they hadn't told him. He showed up at her door one morning with an envelope. Wouldn't explain where it came from. Wouldn't take it back. He told her it was a loan, and they both understood that it wasn't." He looked at Slade steadily. "She still talks about it. 14 years later, and she still talks about the man who showed up at her door when she needed it." He stopped. "I didn't know he had family. I didn't know there were people out there who didn't know where he'd ended up or who he'd been." He stopped again, and something came through his voice that he would have prevented if he'd had more warning it was coming. "I should have tried harder to find out. That's on me." He looked back at Slade, and his voice went flat and certain. "So no, I'm not selling. Not tonight. Not to you. Not this building." The men along the back wall began to move. Not quickly, not with noise. The way a tide moves, which is to say that one moment it is where it is, and the next moment it is somewhere else. And the transition is so steady and so total that you understand it completely only when it has already happened. One by one and 2 by 2, they came away from the back wall and forward, and they arranged themselves in a line behind Boone and Razor, shoulder to shoulder. The ones who had been on opposite sides of the vote an hour ago. The ones who had been swinging at each other 40 minutes ago. The ones who had been divided by money and fear and exhaustion and 12 different versions of the same argument about what the club was and what it owed and what it could survive. All of them, together. Harlan Slade had walked into this building tonight intending to drive a wedge into a crack that was already there. Instead, he had closed it. He looked at the line of men, and his jaw tightened one brief contraction, the only external sign of whatever was happening inside. That was all. Then his eyes went to Loretta. It was not a long look. It was a practical look, the look of a man solving an equation and identifying the simplest variable. His eyes moved to her the way a hand moves to the weakest point in a structure quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. Loretta was sitting in her chair 30 feet from the line of men. There was nothing between her and the door. Slade let his gaze move off her without expression. But every man in the room had registered where it went. Boone saw it. His shoulders shifted a minimal adjustment, the kind a man makes when he has just decided something and is locking that decision down. Everett saw it. His hand on Loretta's shoulder tightened without him deciding to tighten it, a reflex older than thought. And Everett Gaines, who had spent 30 years reading rooms and reading people, and knowing before the words were spoken what a man was going to say, understood in that moment exactly what Harlan Slade had communicated. Not with a threat, not with a word, simply with the direction of his eyes. The message was as clear as if he'd written it on the wall. There is one person in this room who cannot move quickly, and I have noted her location. That understanding settled into Everett's chest like cold water poured slowly. He let go of Loretta's shoulder. He walked out from behind the chair. He crossed the floor of that bar room toward the center of the room, walking slowly and walking straight, and he put himself between Harlan Slade and his wife. Not with his fists raised, not with his voice raised, just a 75-year-old man in a wet gray jacket walking to where he needed to be and stopping there squarely without apology. Slade looked at him. Son, Everett said, one word. And the word had weight in it that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with age, with the particular patience of a man who has already lived through the worst thing he expects to live through and has come out the other side still standing. Slade's expression didn't change, but he didn't speak either. I want to tell you something, Everett said. His voice was calm the way deep water is calm, not because nothing is moving beneath the surface, but because what is moving beneath it is too large and too settled to disturb the surface. I've been in sales my whole life, Everett said. 30 years going door to door in 3 counties telling people why they needed to protect what they'd built. And in 30 years, I learned one thing that matters more than any other. He paused, giving it space. Most men already know what the right thing is. They don't need to be told what it is. They just need somebody to say it out loud so they can't go on pretending they don't know. Slade looked at him without expression. You came here tonight for a piece of property, Everett said. I understand that. That's a business decision, and you made it, and here you are. But I'm going to tell you what else is in this room tonight since you may not have the full picture. He looked at the wall of photographs, then back at Slade. I buried my son 12 years ago, Everett said. Motorcycle accident, wet road, county called us. We buried him and we drove home, and for 12 years, we didn't know who he'd been out here. Didn't know the men he called brothers. Didn't know what he built. Didn't know that anyone remembered his name. He stopped. His voice was steady, not performed, just steady. And I walked in off County Road 9 tonight by pure accident because my fuel line cracked, and this was the only light I could see. And I walked through that door not knowing what I was walking into. And there is my son, on your wall, in a frame, with a brass plate with his name on it. 12 years they've been keeping his memory. 12 years of ringing a bell for him. 12 years of not forgetting. He let that settle in the room. So here is what I know, Everett said. You came here for a building. These men came here to honor their dead and take care of each other. That is what this place is. And I am standing in the middle of this floor, having just found out that my son was known here and loved here and kept here, and I am going to ask you directly. He held Slade's gaze without looking away. Is this really the night you want to be the man who takes that from them, over a property line, with somebody's father standing right here telling you exactly what it means? Because I have nothing left to lose. I buried the worst thing a man can bury, And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of man you can put between yourself and what you want. Not because I can hurt you, because I genuinely do not care what happens to me. He stopped. And I don't believe you want to be the man who does this. Not in front of your own people. Not over a parking lot. Not tonight. The room was absolutely still. Slade looked at Everett Gaines for a long moment with those pale, measuring eyes, doing what they always did, assessing, calculating, looking for the leverage point, looking for the angle that made the problem solvable. Then Slade reached into his vest and produced a folded piece of paper, held it between two fingers. Let Boone see it across the room. Property survey, he said. Deed transfer. Already drawn up by somebody who knows what they're doing. All it requires is a signature. He was looking past Everett now, talking to Boone. 60 seconds, Slade said. After that, I stopped being patient. And that was when one of Slade's men moved. Not toward Boone, not toward the line of Iron Saints. He shifted sideways casually with the practiced ease of a man repositioning his weight, and he put himself between the line of men and Loretta's chair. Not near her, just in the way, just occupying the space between her and the men who might otherwise reach her quickly. It was a single step. In any other room at any other moment, it would have meant nothing. In this room at this moment, it meant everything. Because it meant that if things went wrong, the fastest path from 20 Iron Saints to Loretta Gaines went through one of Slade's men. She was no longer just a variable. She was a position. Boone saw it. His face went still in a particular way, the stillness of something being locked down with considerable force. Razor saw it and uncrossed his arms. Everett felt it before he saw it the way you feel a step. Give under your foot a fraction of a second before you understand what's happening, that brief, terrible wrongness before the knowledge arrives. He started to turn back toward Loretta. Loretta was already standing. She had pushed herself up from the chair without anyone seeing her decide to do it. She was upright, both hands free at her sides, her coat still damp at the shoulders from the rain, her gray hair still carrying the mark of the hat she'd been wearing. She looked at the man who had stepped into the space between her and the room, looked past him at her husband, and then she looked at Harlan Slade. Her face was calm. Not the calm of someone who is not afraid. The calm of someone who has already met the worst thing and knows that fear, whatever it does to the body, does not have to determine what the body does next. The calm of a woman who had spent 12 years carrying a weight that would have bent a lesser person to the ground and had carried it upright anyway every day, because there was no alternative that she was willing to accept. Everett, she said. Just his name. Quietly. Not frightened. Just present. He looked at her. And then Loretta Gaines, 73 years old, heart condition, 5 feet 4 inches in her good shoes, began to walk. Not toward her husband, not toward the back room, not toward the door. She walked toward Harlan Slade. Straight across the barroom floor, past the pieces of chair leg that hadn't been fully cleared, past the edge of the pool table, past the man who had stepped into her path, who stepped back out of it without deciding to, because there is something deep in the human animal that gets out of the road when an old woman walks toward it with that particular look on her face. Boone said ma'am quietly and with urgency, the word carrying everything he didn't have time to say. She didn't stop. One of Slade's men near the door moved his hand to his belt, and Slade raised one finger without looking at him, and he went still. Loretta walked until she was standing in the open space in front of Harlan Slade, close enough to see his face without difficulty, close enough that he had to look down at her. This small woman in a wet-flowered coat with rain still in her gray hair, looking up at the most dangerous man in the room with clear and steady eyes and no flinching. Slade looked back at her. The folded paper was still in his hand. The room did not breathe. You, Loretta said, just that. One word, quiet and direct, carrying everything inside it the way a small container sometimes holds more than its size suggests. Look at me, she said. And Harlan Slade, who had stopped doing what other people told him to do a very long time ago, looked at her. Because there was something in her face that his defenses did not have a mechanism for. Not anger, not accusation, not the performance of courage that he had seen from many people over the years who were actually afraid. something older than all of those things. The face of a woman who had carried real grief for a long time and had come out on the other side of it still standing and still clear-eyed, and who was looking at him now, not as an enemy, but as a problem she had decided to solve in the only way she knew how, which was honestly. I lost my son, Loretta said, on a wet road 12 years ago. Her voice did not waver. It was the voice of a woman who has said the hardest things out loud enough times that the saying of them has become something she can do without being destroyed by the doing. And I have spent every single one of those years, she said, with something missing from inside me that I could not name and could not locate and could not stop looking for. That is what it is when you lose a child. People talk about grief like it's a weather system that passes through. It isn't. It's subtraction. Something that was part of the mathematics of your life is simply gone, and the equation never resolves correctly again. You learn to work around it. You learn to fill the space with other things, but the number doesn't come back. She looked at him steadily. Slade was very still. Every man in this room, she said, is somebody's son. Every one of them was small once and was held by somebody and was the most important thing in the world to somebody. That was true of your son, too. Somewhere there is a woman who watched you come into the world and watched you grow up and prayed that you would turn out well. Something moved behind Slade's eyes. Something that did not have a name in the vocabulary he used daily. Something he had put away in a place he did not visit and had not visited for a very long time. I don't know what road brought you to this room tonight, Loretta said. I don't know what you've been through or what you've had to do or who you've had to become to get here. But I know this. Whatever you believe this building is going to give you, it is not worth one of these men. It is not worth one of yours. She held his gaze with those clear, exhausted, undefeated eyes. Go home, she said. Whatever's waiting out there, go home to it. It is not too late to walk out that door and not become the thing that the woman who loved you was afraid you might become. Not tonight. Not yet. That door is right there. And there is still time. The paper in Slade's hand did not move. His men did not move. No one in the room moved. The rain on the roof was the only thing in the world that was still doing anything. Harlan Slade looked at Loretta Gaines for a long time. Longer than he looked at most things, longer than the calculating eyes usually stayed in one place, because the calculating eyes were not calculating now. Something different was happening behind them. Something that belonged to a part of him that hadn't been consulted in years, that he had sealed off with considerable intention and maintained with considerable discipline. His jaw moved once. He breathed slowly. The paper bent slightly in his grip as something shifted. And then Harlan Slade looked past Loretta at the wall of photographs behind the bar, at all those decades of faces, at the brass plates under the ones who were gone, at the flag above the bar with its faded stitching. His pale eyes moved across that wall and slowed and stopped. They stopped on Connor's photograph. He looked at it. Not 3 seconds. Longer. Long enough that the men on both sides of the room began to understand that something was happening in Harlan Slade that none of them had expected and that none of them had a name for. Long enough that Razor at the back of the line let his arms fall to his sides. Long enough that even the men near the door shifted slightly uncertain. Slade had built everything he had on a single operating principle, that sentiment is a door left unlocked, and unlocked doors are invitations, and you walk through invitations. He had believed this absolutely for a very long time. He believed it right up until this moment. Then something in his face moved. Not dramatically, just enough. The way a foundation shifts before you find the crack in the wall above it. He looked back down at Loretta, and something crossed his face that had not been there when he walked in. Something old. Something from before whatever had made him into what he was now. It appeared for a moment, and then it was gone, but everyone in the room who was paying attention saw it. He folded the paper. He put it back inside his vest. He looked at his men near the door, and his voice when he spoke was quiet, barely caring. "We're done here," he said. One of his men started to speak, started with the word Harlan, And Slade said, I said we're done with the same quietness, and the man stopped. Slade looked at the wall of photographs one final time, then at the old woman in front of him. Something moved in his face one more time, something he didn't name and didn't explain. Some things you don't take, he said, almost to himself, almost to the photographs. He turned and walked out. One by one, without another word spoken by anyone, his men followed. The door opened. Cold air came through it. Then the door closed and the room listened to the sound of boots on gravel and engines starting one by one and headlights swinging across the windows in arcs and then straightening toward the highway and the sound of the engines stretching out and thinning as the distance increased. And then the rain took them apart completely and there was nothing left of them at all. Nothing but the rain. 20 men stood in the silence of that room. They had won something tonight. They knew that. But what they had just witnessed was not something any of them had a ready framework for. It was the kind of thing you carry home and put down somewhere and come back to over days and weeks and understand a little more each time. The kind of thing that sits with you. Boone crossed the room to Loretta. She was still standing in the center of the floor in the space where Slade had been. Upright, back straight. She had not moved since he left. But the stillness in her had changed quality the way a rope changes when the load is lifted, a different kind of still. Boone reached her just as her knees began to soften, and he caught her by both arms with those enormous careful hands and held her steady. He walked her back to the chair by the heater and eased her into it, and crouched down in front of her, this massive gray-bearded man on one knee on a barroom floor, and he took both her hands in his. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to minimize that or move away from it. Ma'am, he said, in 61 years, I have not seen anything like what you just did. Loretta smiled at him. It was a real smile, the tired kind, the kind that comes from the far side of something. I'm an old woman with a bad heart, she said. What was he going to do? She patted his hand with both of hers. Your friend, she said then. My Connor. Was he happy out here? In the end, was he really happy? Boone couldn't speak for a moment. The words had to find their way through something. He was the happiest man I ever knew, Boone said finally. His voice was careful with each word carrying them. He used to say this club was proof that broken things could still build something worth having together. He believed that completely. He believed it to the very end. He never stopped. He looked at the wall. He would have loved tonight, Boone said. He would have loved knowing it was his parents who came through that door and reminded us of it. Everett had come to stand behind Loretta's chair. His hand was on her shoulder back where it belonged. He looked at Boone and at the room full of men who were still standing where they'd been when Slade walked out. None of them quite ready to move yet, all of them still held by the specific gravity of what had happened here. Outside the rain went on, but it had begun almost imperceptibly to ease. The rain let go gradually, the way exhaustion finally lets go in stages. The hard sideways sheets thinning first to something steadier and more vertical, and then to the fine cold mist that you feel on your face before you hear it on the roof. The neon sign outside kept throwing red light across the wet gravel and the chrome of the motorcycles standing in their rows. Inside the clubhouse, the heater ticked steadily, and someone had turned the overhead lights down to something warmer, and the room had settled into a quiet that was entirely different from the quiet that had existed before the storm. This quiet had something in it. The other quiet had just been the absence of noise. Boone came back from the rear of the building with 2 blankets, the wool kind, and handed them to Everett without ceremony. Everett draped one around Loretta's shoulders and kept the other across his arm. She had stopped shivering entirely. Her color was good. She was sitting with her 3rd cup of coffee pressed into her hands by someone without being asked. And she was listening to a man named Dix tell her about a road trip he and Connor had taken up into Colorado in the summer of '93, about how Connor had insisted on stopping at every roadside diner they passed, because he maintained that you could learn everything essential about a town from the quality of its coffee and the state of its pie. He drank a lot of bad coffee, Loretta said. Dix laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him. He really did. He was absolutely committed to the research. She smiled and let her eyes be wet. There was no reason to do anything else with them. Everett stood a little apart at the end of the bar, holding his coffee in both hands and listening. That was what the night had become after everything else it had been. Stories coming forward. Men coming toward him in ones and twos, not organized, not directed, just the way things come out when something has cracked the seal on them after a long time. A pressure releasing. 12 years of stored memory, finding the people it had always been heading toward. A man named Carver, broad and quiet, with the look of someone who had spent years doing physical work and was comfortable in his body because of it, told him about the time Connor had persuaded a county sheriff out of impounding 3 of their bikes by delivering with total calm and considerable length a legal argument about the distinction between loitering and congregation, a distinction that Carver was fairly certain Connor had invented in real time, but had delivered with such complete conviction that the sheriff had ultimately thanked them for the clarification and driven away satisfied. He could have sold snow to Alaskans, Carver said. He could. Everett agreed. He got that from his mother. Across the room, Loretta looked up at him with the expression she had worn for 49 years whenever he said something that she found both accurate and slightly annoying, and chose not to respond to it. A younger man who had been quiet all evening, barely 30, with a scar across his chin that spoke of a history of learning things the hard and permanent way, came and stood near Everett and spent a while looking at his boots before anything came out of him. When it did come, he kept his voice down the way you keep your voice when something is still fragile. Connor taught me to ride, the young man said. His name was Tully. I came to this club when I was 19 and I didn't know anyone, and I didn't have much of anything, and I was the kind of person that most people look past. Connor just started showing up. Not in a big way, not making anything of it, just showing up and showing me things, and never making me feel like I was supposed to be grateful. He looked at Everett. I don't know if that means anything to you, he said. Everett looked at him for a moment. It means everything to me, he said. That was the shape of what the night became. Story after story coming out of these men like water that has been held behind something for a long time and has finally found a channel. Not one of them brought up the accident. Not one of them, in all the hours that followed, talked about the way Connor had died. They talked about the way he had lived. The road trips and the running out of gas and the bad jokes. The hitchhiker outside Muskogee who got Connor's last $20 and left Connor 11 miles from the nearest gas station in the middle of an August that was making a serious argument for itself as the hottest on record, and Connor walking the whole way in the heat and laughing about it the entire time, according to Razor, who had been on the back of the bike and who had not found it funny at the time and who could not now tell the story without laughing. Razor had not looked at Everett directly since Slade walked out the door. He was across the room, mostly near the bar, doing things that didn't need doing. Moving objects, wiping surfaces that were already clean. The specific busyness of a man who has something on him that he hasn't yet found a way to approach. Everett watched him the way he had always watched people who were working up to something. Quietly, without making it obvious, giving it time. Around midnight, Boone walked them down a short hallway to the back of the building and showed them a room with a bed and a lamp on a small table and a window that looked out at the dark field behind the property. It was spare and clean and obviously Boone's own room, and Everett started to say something about that, and Boone said simply, "You sleep here," and the subject was closed in the way Boone closed most subjects. Loretta sat on the edge of the bed and Everett sat beside her, and they were quiet for a while in the way that people are quiet together when they have been married long enough that silence doesn't require explanation. "He was out there all along," Loretta said. "Yes," Everett said. She looked at her hands. "I kept thinking we should have gone looking, should have gotten in the car and driven east and knocked on doors." Everett put his hand over hers. "He wasn't lost," he said. "That's what they've been telling us all night. He wasn't lost at all. He was exactly where he decided to be." She turned her hand and held his. "He was going to come home," she said. "I know he was. He had a plan. He just hadn't gotten to the part where he executed it yet." "He was," Everett said, and he put enough certainty into it that he could almost believe it was something he knew rather than something he needed to be true. Loretta lay down and Everett covered her with the blanket, and she was asleep in minutes, the deep, unguarded sleep of someone who has set down a weight they have been carrying for so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like to not be carrying it. Her breathing was steady and easy, and her face in the low light was the face he had known for nearly 50 years, and Everett sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her sleep until he turned the lamp off. He sat in the dark and listened to the rain quieting outside the window, and he thought about a boy who had come to this flat stretch of Oklahoma and found his people and built something and been genuinely happy in it. He thought about 12 years of not knowing that, about what that not knowing had cost Loretta, about what it had cost him, about whether finding it now, late as it was, could do anything about the cost. He sat with that for a while and decided that it was not a question that had an answer, or rather that it had the only answer that these kinds of questions ever have, which is that both things are true, and you hold them both and you go on. The loss was real. The finding was real. Neither one erased the other. You just carried both. He thought he could do that. He believed Loretta already was. He was still sitting there when the rain stopped entirely. The silence that followed was complete, the deep, clean silence of open country. After weather has spent itself, and somewhere out beyond the dark field, something that was probably an owl called once into that silence, and then let it alone. Everett closed his eyes. The light came slowly, the way October light comes in that part of Oklahoma gray first, through the window glass, and then gradually over the course of an hour, becoming the thin, clear gold of a morning that has earned its clarity by having the night washed out of it thoroughly. Everett woke in the chair with a stiff neck and the sounds of a building coming awake around him. Boots on wood floors, voices kept low, the distant, purposeful sound of something mechanical. Loretta was still asleep. He eased out of the room without waking her and walked up the hallway to the main room. The clubhouse looked different in the morning, less enormous, more itself. The broken glass was gone, and the pool table was properly righted, and someone had straightened the chairs and cleaned the bar. And the room had the particular look of a place that has been through something substantial and has been put back in order as a deliberate act. Not just cleaning, but making a statement about what this place is and what it intends to continue being. Two men were in the kitchen area making eggs and coffee. They nodded at Everett without making anything of it, and one of them, Dix, poured a cup and slid it across the bar without being asked. Everett sat on a stool and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the wall of photographs in the morning light. Connor's face looked back at him from the black frame. That grin, that dark hair, the happiness in him so complete it was still visible 20 years later in a photograph on a wall in a barroom in eastern Oklahoma. Everett sat with that for a while and let it be what it was. Boone came in from outside with his jacket on and the cold morning on him and sat on the stool beside Everett and accepted a cup from Dix, and they sat together in the way men sometimes sit together when there's nothing that needs to be said right now, and both of them know it. "We'll look at your car this morning," Boone said after a while. "Razor runs the shop out back. There's not much he can't sort out." "You don't have to do that," Everett said. Boone looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "We do." They drank their coffee. "I've been trying to find the right thing to say," Everett said after a while. "There's probably something that a man is supposed to say in a situation like this. Something that covers it." He stopped. "I don't have it." Boone looked at his cup. "Me either," he said. They left it there. Some things are better left exactly the size they are. Loretta came up the hallway about an hour later, moving carefully, but without assistance, and Dix made her eggs before she sat down, and she ate them at the bar, and the morning filled up with the ordinary sounds of people sharing a space. It was surprising how quickly it ceased to feel surprising, these men moving around the room. This room with Connor on the wall, Loretta asking Tully questions about the motorcycle he'd been working on that she couldn't fully follow, but was clearly listening to for something underneath the technical information. Around 9, Razor came through the back door, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped when he saw Everett. He looked at the rag. He folded it once and held it. "Fuel line," he said. "Crack through up near the intake. Should have gone a month ago. You've been running on luck." He stopped. 20 minutes to fix," he said. "Got everything I need in the shop." He paused. "I'll take care of it." What do I owe you, Everett said. Razor's jaw tightened. He shook his head one short, definite movement and went back through the door. Everett finished his coffee and put on his jacket and went out through the back door into the morning. The air was cold and clean and smelled like wet earth, and the sky above the flat fields was the specific wash blue that only comes after a hard rain has taken everything superfluous out of it. The shop was a concrete block building with two bay doors standing open. An inside Razor was already under the front end of the sedan with a trouble light, working with the focused efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. Everett stood at the edge of the bay and listened to the sounds of competent work. After a few minutes, Razor came out from under the car and sat up and turned a fitting in the light. He set it aside and reached for the new one from the parts tray. Connor used to work on cars, Everett said. Razor was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, he was good at it, better than he gave himself credit for. He said he learned from his dad. Everett looked out at the field. He did, Everett said. We spent 2 summers taking apart a '68 Impala in the garage. Never did get it running properly, but we spent the summers. Razor fitted the new line into place and began tightening it. That's the part that matters, he said quietly. They were quiet again. Razor worked. Everett stood in the bay door and watched the morning light move across the field toward the tree line. Then Razor said, I'm sorry. He said it to the engine, to the fitting, to the space under the hood. But it was said clearly enough. For how I talked to you when you came in, Razor said. I called you nobody. He stopped. His hands stilled. You weren't nobody, he said. You were the last thing I expected on the worst night we'd had in years, and I didn't handle it right. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he walked across the bay and crouched down beside Razor, which took more from his knees than it used to, and he put his hand on the younger man's shoulder. You were protecting your home, Everett said. The place your brother's picture is on the wall. He waited until Razor looked at him. Connor would have done exactly the same thing. Don't carry it. Razor looked at him with an expression that Everett knew. He had seen it in mirrors for 12 years. The expression of someone holding something together in their face that is determined to come apart. He was a good man, Razor said. His voice had gone rough with it. I know, Everett said. I'm glad you knew him. He stood back up and left Razor to finish the work. An hour later, Razor came through the back door and set the keys on the bar in front of Everett and Loretta without looking at either of them. Everett picked them up. Razor, he said. The young man stopped with his back still turned. Thank you, Everett said. Razor nodded without turning around, and his shoulders were tight, and he went through the door to the back of the building. It was Tully who came and found Everett a few minutes later and said quietly that Razor was out behind the shop. Everett set his cup down. He found Razor leaning against the back wall of the concrete block building, with his arms crossed and his head down and the October sun on his shoulders. Razor heard him coming and didn't look up. They stood there together without speaking, and the fields ran flat and gold to the tree line, and a hawk was working the thermals above the far fence line, patient and unhurried. After a while, Razor made a sound that wasn't a word, something that didn't have a word for it, but didn't need one. Everett didn't try to answer it. He put his hand on Razor's shoulder and left it there. That was all. Just staying. Just being present to it. Some things don't need to be witnessed by more than one person to be real. They just need someone to stay. After a while, Razor straightened up and looked at the field, and then at the sky, and then he nodded once to himself or to something, and the tightness in his shoulders eased by degrees. They walked back in together without talking about it. The whole club was outside when they came around the front of the building. All 20 men standing in the gravel lot in the morning sun without anyone having organized it or suggested it. Just there in their leathers, the chrome on the bikes catching the light, the puddles in the low spots going gold and shrinking as the morning warmed. Boone walked with Everett and Loretta to the car. He stopped and reached inside his vest and brought out a small cardboard box. He held it out. Inside was a leather patch, worn. The edges soft with years of handling. The colors faded from whatever they had been originally to something richer and more complicated, the specific richness that comes from a thing being real for a long time. Iron saints across the top, the same patch that was on every vest in the lot. Connors, Boone said. He wore it from the day we patched him in. I kept it because I didn't know where else it should go. He looked at Everett. I know now. Everett took the box and looked at the patch. He turned it in his hands. The leather had the smoothness of years of wear, years of a body moving inside a vest, the particular texture of something that has been genuinely used. Connor's warmth was gone from it long ago, but the shape of it was still there, the shape of something that had been held and worn and cared for. He closed the box, he held it. Boone reached into his vest again and produced a slip of paper folded twice. My number, he said. I mean this plainly. You call me for anything, anything at all. A ride, a roof, a problem you need more than one person for. Anything. He looked at Everett and then at Loretta. Connor's family is our family. That is not something I'm saying to be polite. That is a vow. We don't break those. Loretta stepped forward. She put her arms around Boone as far as they would reach, which was not far given the difference in their sizes, and he bent down and held her with that careful, enormous gentleness, his big hands light on her back. She spoke into his chest. Will you do something for me, she said. Anything, Boone said, without hesitation. Ring his bell this year, she said, and when you do, tell him his mother and father found his brothers. Tell him we know now. Tell him he was loved out here, that the people who loved him took care of him all this time. She paused. He'd want to know, we know. That would matter to him. Boone could not speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was careful with itself, the way a voice gets when too many things are happening behind it at once. I'll tell him, he said. I promise you that. I will tell him. He was crying. He didn't try to prevent it or minimize it or look away from it. He stood in the gravel lot in the morning sun with 20 of his men behind him, and he held a small woman and he cried, and not one of the men in that lot made any movement or any sound that suggested there was anything unusual about watching their president cry in a parking lot on a clear October morning, because there wasn't. Some things are exactly what they look like. When Loretta stepped back, her eyes were wet and clear, and she looked at the 20 men in the lot, at all of them, one after another. Thank you, she said. All of you, for taking care of him when we couldn't be there. Dix lifted his chin. Tully put his fist briefly to his chest. Carver looked at the ground and then back up and nodded. Razor was at the back of the group. When Loretta's eyes found him, he met them, held them, and nodded once. She nodded back. Everything that needed to be said between them was in that. Everett shook Boone's hand. The kind of handshake that means what it means and doesn't need anything added to it. He helped Loretta into the passenger seat and closed her door and walked around and got in. The engine turned over on the first try and ran clean. Razor's work. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Loretta was looking out her window at the men in the lot. At the building behind them, low and plain, the neon sign dark in the daylight. At the wall inside it that she couldn't see from here, but could picture now in complete detail and would be able to picture for the rest of her life with total clarity whenever she needed to. She put her hand on his hand on the wheel. He drove. The first time they came back was 3 weeks later on a Sunday unannounced, and Loretta had a pot of chili in the back seat because she said she was not arriving at anyone's house empty-handed, and Everett had learned decades ago not to take a position against that particular tone. The pot fed 14 men and left nothing worth mentioning, and 3 of those men asked her for the recipe, and she wrote it out by hand for each of them on separate pieces of paper, as though sharing a single copy would somehow compromise the result. After that, it was simply a thing that happened. Sunday dinners most weeks. The men learned to watch their language around her, not because anyone told them to, not because she asked, but because something about her presence made them want to without being told. She never asked them to be different from what they were. They just were. Everett taught them cribbage over the course of several months. He lost consistently and obviously until Carver noticed and called him on it, and Everett admitted it without embarrassment, and they played honestly after that. He won most of the time anyway. Connor's photograph stayed on the wall where it had always been, but there were now 2 people who came through the door who looked at it differently than anyone else in the room did, and the men understood that distinction, And it shifted something in how they looked at it too. Not more than they had before, just differently. The way a thing looks different when you know more of its story than you knew before. The vote about the clubhouse came around again 6 months after that night properly, this time without the prelude. It wasn't close. No one suggested selling. Instead, with Everett's involvement in a grant he located through connections that 30 years in business had built and maintained, they converted the back half of the building. The garage bays stayed but were set up properly. Workbenches, a tool inventory organized and labeled, a schedule on the wall, and a process for following it. They called it Preacher's Shop. It opened on a March morning without ceremony because Boone was not a man for ceremonies and never had been. He unlocked the bay doors at 7 o'clock, and the first kid showed up at 7:30, a 15-year-old from the town of OK, Oklahoma, whose school counselor had heard about the program through a county network and thought it might be worth a try. The boy stood in the doorway of the bay the way Everett and Loretta had stood in the doorway of the main building 8 months before, reading the room, trying to determine whether this was actually a place he was allowed to be. Tully walked over and told him to come in. Over the sign on the bay door, painted in plain letters on a piece of wood, was a line in Everett's handwriting. He had painted it himself one afternoon while Loretta sat in a folding chair nearby and drank coffee and offered commentary on his brushwork that was accurate, if not entirely encouraging. The sign said, "Everybody can rest here." The boys came after that, slowly and then more regularly, and then as a matter of established routine. The kind of boys that social workers describe in paperwork with phrases like "at risk" or "disconnected," which are the paperwork's way of saying boys who have not yet found the thing that tells them what they're worth. Some stayed for a few months and moved on. Some stayed for years. Some came back after they'd gotten somewhere to help teach the ones who were just starting. Connor would have known every one of them. That was not something anyone said out loud. It was simply something that the men of the Iron Saints carried the way you carry things that don't need to be spoken to be real. Loretta's heart held on considerably longer than her doctors had any reason to predict after that October night. Year 3 of her checkups produced results her cardiologist described as not what I'd expect. Year 4 the same. Year 5. She never explained to the doctor what had changed. She did not think he would have the framework for it. She died on a Thursday morning in the spring in the bedroom of the house on Garfield Street where she and Everett had lived for 41 years. Peacefully. Everett was beside her in the chair he'd moved next to the bed 3 weeks before, when it became clear what the coming weeks were going to require. She had been asleep, and then she was simply gone, and the room was very quiet, and the morning light came through the curtains exactly as it always had. Boone got the call before noon. 20 riders came for the funeral, arriving from all directions the evening before, dispersing quietly to wherever they were staying, not making anything of themselves. They filled the back 4 pews of the church the next morning, in their leathers, with their hands in their laps, and their faces composed. And the people of that town who didn't know them looked once and looked away, and the people who knew Everett and Loretta looked at them and understood without being told that these were people who had earned the right to be there. Boone gave the eulogy. He had asked Everett's permission, and Everett had said yes immediately and without qualification. He stood at the front of that church in his leather vest and held the sides of the lectern with both hands and told the congregation about a night in October 2008, about a woman who had walked across a barroom floor in a flowered coat toward the most dangerous man in the room, with nothing in her hands, and changed the entire direction of the evening with nothing but the truth of what she had lost and what she still believed. He got through most of it. Near the end, his voice stopped working, and he stood in the silence of the church for a moment, and the 20 men in the back 4 pews were looking at the floor or the ceiling or somewhere in the middle distance, each of them in their own way carrying the same thing. And after a moment, Boone found it again. "She walked in," he said, "with a bad heart and a good one, and she saved every man in that room, mine included." He stepped back. They carried her out. The honor line at the church door was 20 men in leather with their heads bowed, and they held it until the last person had passed through, and then they fell in behind and walked to the graveside in the April sun. She was buried on a hill with cedar trees at the edges, next to the plot that had been kept for Everett, next to the stone that had been placed for Connor 12 years before. The three of them together on that hill, the way things sometimes arrange themselves in the end, despite everything that tried to prevent it, into the shape they were always supposed to have. Everett lived 4 more years. They were full years, not easy. Grief doesn't conclude because you've made a kind of peace with it. But there were Sunday dinners and cribbage games and a shop full of boys who needed someone to tell them what they were worth, and a photograph on a wall that he could look at now and feel something in addition to absence. The absence never went away. But it had company now. That was something. He was in the shop on a Wednesday morning in July, a couple of years after Loretta, when Razor came in and said he wanted to introduce somebody. The boy was 17, tall with Razor's same jaw and Razor's same watchful, careful eyes, and none of Razor's lifelong instinct for leading with his chin. He stood in the door of the bay, the way all of them stood in the door of the bay, reading the room before committing to it. Everett looked at him. He looked at Razor. Razor's expression was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has found a way to set it down without making too much of the setting down. "This is my son," Razor said. "He wants to learn engines." Everett looked at the boy again. The jaw, the watchful eyes, 17 years old and trying to look like he wasn't hoping for anything in particular. He thought about a garage on Garfield Street in 2 summers in a '68 Impala that never did run right, but that's not what those summers were about. He looked at Razor. Razor was looking at the floor. Then he looked up and his eyes met Everett's, and he held them, and in his face was everything he had not said out loud and was not going to say out loud, and probably never would, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. 12 years of Connor showing up at his mother's door with an envelope. Connor on the back roads. Connor on the wall. Connor's father in this bay for 3 years, teaching boys what they were worth, one at a time at no particular speed. Razor reached out and shook Everett's hand. "Connor would have liked him," Razor said. Everett held the handshake and looked at the boy in the doorway. "Come in," he said. "Close the door behind you. Let's see what you know." The boy came in. The bay door stayed open. The morning light came through it the way light comes through an open door without being asked, and without explaining itself, just filling what's there. The motorcycles stood in their rows outside in the sun. Inside the main building, Connor's photograph was on the wall where it had been for 19 years now, in its plain black frame, with the brass plate below it and all the other faces around it and the flag above the bar. The sign above the bay door in Everett's handwriting, the letter slightly uneven because Loretta had been right about his brushwork. "Everybody can rest here." That was where it had started. An old man on the worst night of a bad year pushing open a door he had no reason to push open and asking one question. A room full of men who had been breaking each other apart and who had the answer and didn't know it yet. A woman who walked across that room with nothing in her hands toward the most dangerous man in it and changed everything with the only thing she had, which was the truth. A boy on a wall who had been waiting 12 years to bring his parents home. Everett Gaines was buried the following winter beside Loretta, beside Connor. 3 graves on a hill with cedar trees at the edges. In January cold, the ground hard, and the sky low and flat and pale. The whole club came. More than had come for Loretta because the story had spread in the years between, had found people who understood what they were riding for, who came from distances that would have seemed unreasonable to anyone who didn't understand the reason. Boone stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and the wind off the fields moving through his gray beard, and he did not try to speak because there was nothing left to say that the last 5 years had not said better and more completely than he could manage with words right now. He stood there until it was time to go. Then he walked back to his bike in the winter light and swung a leg over and sat for a moment with his hand on the throttle and his eyes on the road that ran straight through the flat, pale country toward the horizon. The asphalt dark against the dead winter grass, running honest and unambiguous for as far as he could see. He thought about a young man on a motorcycle on that road. Dark hair, the grin that took up his whole face. He thought about a fuel line cracking on a wet night and 2 old people walking through the rain toward the only light there was. He thought about the things you don't know you're missing until they walk through your door and change everything just by being there. He thought about a woman in a flowered coat walking across a barroom floor with nothing in her hands. He thought about a boy on a wall. He started the engine. The road ran on ahead of him, clear and open and waiting, the way roads do when there's still somewhere to go and something worth going for. And Boone Rourke rode out into the winter morning and carried all of it with him, the grief and the gratitude and the 12 years and the 5 years. And the night the rain came sideways on County Road 9, and an old man pushed open a door and asked one question: can we rest here? The answer had turned out to be bigger than anyone in that room could have imagined. Yes, rest here. The lost can rest here. The grieving can rest here. The ones who think they're past saving, and the ones who've given up hoping anyone will come, and the ones who are right in the middle of tearing themselves apart. Rest here. Everybody can.